This week on History Chat, our speakers are Teresa Sanders and Jake O'Leary. Their topic is the British Popular Front and the Spanish Civil War.
My name is Jake O'Leary. I am a second-year PhD student at the University of Bristol, and I look at anti-fascist women writers and modernist magazine culture.
My name is Teresa Sanders. I am a third-year PhD student based at the University of Exeter, and my research looks at Sylvia Townsend Warner and her representations of education and pedagogy.
And today we're talking about the British Popular Front and its relation to the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39. And one reason for this is the enduring legacy of the Spanish Civil War and its importance in Britain today. So it was recently reported in a local newspaper in Hull that in March a statue has been unveiled and dedicated to people from Hull who volunteered for the Spanish Republic and went to Spain during the Civil War. And it was reported that on the 21st of April, the last British volunteer for the International Brigades, Geoffrey Cervantes, died at the age of 99, and news of his death was retweeted by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. So clearly, even now, 80 years after the Spanish Republic fell to General Franco and the war came to a close, the Spanish Civil War clearly is extremely important still. Its memory is very important for people in Britain today.
And following on from that, it's really important to mention as well that with the unveiling of that statue in Hull, Hull is also the City of Culture from 2017 and through till 2020. And I think that's really important. We're thinking about the Spanish Civil War as a historical conflict, but also an event of unusual kind of political, ideological and emotional significance as well, which is obviously something that we're interested in. And most people will be familiar with the Spanish Civil War from a literary perspective, particularly through the works of Auden, W.H. Auden that is, and George Orwell, as well as through Ernest Hemingway. So thinking about the extent to which the Spanish Civil War was significant, not only for the Spanish people, but also for people in Europe and sort of beyond Spanish borders, and particularly thinking about the influence of the Popular Front. So the focus of this podcast is going to be considering the importance of that Popular Front, which has multiple meanings that we will discuss, particularly from the perspective of Britain as a British kind of literary left, and focusing on the organisations of the Left Review and the Left Book Club.
Okay, so we should probably start off with some kind of general historical background about the Spanish Civil War, and then we can go into talking about British responses to it. So, in February 1936, what was called a Popular Front government was elected in Spain. The Second Spanish Republic had been declared only 5 years previously in 1931, so it was a very new democracy. And the Popular Front government was a very broad left-wing coalition spanning Republicans through Liberals and then to Socialists. And it was elected, it replaced a very reactionary right-wing government, and it came to power promising some social reforms that were intended to improve the lives of the poor and the working class in Spain. So, one policy they had was a policy of redistribution of land to peasants in the deep south of Spain. And they also wanted to implement educational reforms as well. And one element of that is actually providing more education to women. Historically, levels of education for women in Spain have been very low for reasons of traditional conservative and Catholic culture. So the Popular Front government came to power in February 1936, and then the reactionary elements of Spanish society, so the military establishment, the aristocratic establishment, and the church as well, were so implacably opposed to the reforms that the government wanted to carry out that they mounted a military coup in July 1936. That took place on the 17th through to the 18th of July. This coup was intended to be very quick, displacing the government quickly and establishing a military dictatorship. But people in the Republic resisted. A lot of the resistance was uncoordinated by the government, actually. It came spontaneously from the people themselves in their capacity as trade unionists and members of political parties. And people in the Republic managed to resist the coup. And then from there on in, a war of attrition started between the Francoists, or the nationalists, on the one hand, the people who mounted the coup, and then on the other hand, the Spanish Republic. So you had these kind of two opposing sides, and there was a lot of political diversity within each camp, but those were the two main forces opposing each other throughout the war. and then the war continued for 3 years, coming to an end in April 1939.
And I suppose it's kind of worth noting here that when we're thinking about the 1930s in particular, it's worth saying that it's not just in Spain that there are kind of huge shifts politically and ideologically speaking. So when we're thinking about the 30s more broadly, it's really important to acknowledge that this was a period of really complicated politics across Europe. So you had the election of Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933 and the remilitarization of the Rhineland, Mussolini's aggression in Abyssinia, and I think that there's this whole sense of fascism on the move. Thinking about the Popular Front, it was imported from France, wasn't it? I think originally. So in 1934, the French Communist Party had adopted a programme of alliance for all progressive and kind of democratic forces, so liberals, socialists, under the banner of what was actually called a People's Front, which became a Popular Front. I think it was kind of used interchangeably. And this movement was kind of endorsed by Communist International, which is kind of shorthand as the Comintern. And in addition to February 1936 with the election of the Popular Front in Spain, there was also, in May 1936, France had elected a Popular Front government under Leon Blum. Apologies for the potentially bad pronunciation. So there's a huge shift culturally, but also socially, politically, within Europe in which there are alliances forming. And actually, one of the questions that we can ask is, why was the Spanish Civil War so significant in relation to this? It's worth saying with Franco, the military coup, and this kind of pushing against the progressive ideals, effectively, of the Republic and the Popular Front, that it didn't just become a civil war fought on Spanish soil. It became much, much bigger than that, and was seen as many people as representative of democracy, of sort of this great ideal of democracy, embodied and led by the young Spanish Republic. As Jake said, sort of you have the Second Republic, so it's still very, very, very young, crusading against and resisting fascism, which was, embodied or epitomised by Franco's kind of the nationalist rebels. And this was I think fascism was a political system that was threatening to engulf all of Europe. That's where the Popular Front comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, fascism is the prime motivating force for the Popular Front coming together, and for a wide spectrum of people on the left, you know, spanning from bourgeois liberals and Republicans all the way through to communists and even anarchists as well, coming together to resist fascism. So it's really the rise of fascism, particularly from Hitler's election in 1933, that signals the coming together of the Popular Front. There's an official shift in Comintern policy at the 7th Annual Congress of the Comintern in 1935, where the Comintern pivots away from a policy that stated that communist parties should only work with other working class organisations to resist fascism. At that point in 1935, they began to advocate very broad alliances with middle class parties and middle class political actors to resist fascism as well. And that's where that Popular Front coalition comes in. And so it was a kind of pan-European, transnational phenomenon, and it manifests itself differently in different countries. So as you were saying, Teresa, you had the election of Popular Front governments in France and in Spain before the military coup in July 1936. So those were electoral projects. In Britain, that couldn't happen because we had the national government, which was conservative-led, although there were former right-wing Labour members in that government as well, members of Parliament. And you also had a pretty conservative Labour Party as well that didn't really want to collaborate with other organisations or parties on the left. So the Popular Front in Britain, it couldn't be parliamentary, and it had to express itself in other ways, and one of the primary ways in which it did was through culture. So it was, a lot of the activity was inspired by and coordinated by the Communist Party, but actually people from across the liberal left came together in organisations to produce culture that would raise anti-fascist consciousness in the British public at large. So they organised theatre groups, they had their own magazines, the Left Book Club, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They had musical groups, they would put on concerts. All of this cultural activity sat alongside and informed the political activity and political organising that people on the Popular Front were engaging in as well. And as we'll be talking about today, the rise of the British Popular Front and the campaign to aid the Spanish Republic are pretty much simultaneous. So a lot of what people in Britain are doing to oppose fascism at home and raise consciousness about it is deeply related to their activities to raise money for the Spanish Republic, go and volunteer for it, put pressure on the national government to support the Spanish Republic as well. So all of these things are interrelated.
In relation to that, if the British Popular Front was a culture fighting against fascism, the reasons why that came about in Britain as well, as Jake has said, that in Spain and in France these were parliamentary electoral alliances, so in terms of running the country, whereas in Britain this definitely was not the case. And also, why did people come together and form this Popular Front? And I think the election of the national government in Britain in 1931 with a landslide defeat of the Labour Party as well, which was quite significant. But a lot of people also felt that the government had just kind of atrophied and wasn't really involved in, and sort of was taking a real back seat, which a lot of people found really difficult to deal with. And this is also, we're talking about the mid to late 1930s, but this is also coming after the Great Depression and the economic slump, mass unemployment in the UK as well. So there are lots of different things that contributed to this sense of something needs to change.
Yeah, and I think as well as people being under the impression that the national government was, as you say, atrophied or, not really doing anything to alleviate the crisis of the Depression in the 30s in Britain, a lot of people were worried, particularly on the left, about its authoritarianism and actually the capacity for fascism to gain a foothold in Britain as well. You did have Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, who were obviously the fascist party in Britain in the early 1930s, or throughout the 30s actually. But people were also worried about the national government. And actually the national government's policy in relation to Spain is important here. So the national government agreed a policy that was called non-intervention with several other countries, including France and the USA. And initially, actually, the Soviet Union, Germany and Italy as well. The policy of non-intervention stated that none of these countries would authorise sales of arms to Spain. And the rationale for that was that it would contain the conflict and not let it grow into a kind of broader conflagration in Europe. But in actual fact, immediately, I think it was only about a week after the beginning of the war, when things were not looking good for the nationalists and General Franco, who would go on to become the clear leader and obviously dictator of Spain for several decades after the war. Things were not looking good for the nationalists, and at that point, Franco appealed to Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy for aid, which he got immediately. And Italy and Germany continued to supply Franco with military advantages throughout the war, and the national government in Britain turned a blind eye to this. And what this meant was the Spanish Republic couldn't very easily buy arms to defend itself. The Soviet Union did help it and did supply some military personnel and some weaponry, but the Republic usually had to go through kind of international black market channels to get around non-intervention, which meant it spent way more than it should have done on fairly shoddy arms. And actually, non-intervention meant that the Republic really should have won the war fairly quickly, and in the end it turned into a war of attrition, which gradually turned in Franco's favour. So, in opposition to the feeling of the British public about Spain, that did not think that Britain should recognise the Franco government, in opposition to this feeling, the actions of the national government in Britain throughout the war aided Franco, essentially, and worked against the Republic.
It's interesting, isn't it, thinking about kind of British politics, particularly in this time, with this policy of non-intervention as well. The fact, obviously, that Germany and Italy kind of flouted that but even though they were signatories of this non-intervention agreement, that they did actually then help Franco and sort of sway his win in the end. Although actually there were people in the British government, Churchill I think is the classic example really, who recognised that peace in Europe would be served by the defeat of fascism in Spain. But as you say, Jake, the British government almost turned a blind eye to it and was appeasing fascist powers, really, in many, many ways. And sort of, and even the voices of protest didn't really deflect British policy, which I think is then where the British Popular Front becomes so significant. The fact that it's going against the British government's viewpoint. And, I mean, certainly very early on in the war, sort of November 36, Franco failed to take Madrid, didn't he?
Yes, and this is partly as a result of the formation of the international brigades.
Yes, exactly.
So the international brigades were the Spanish government, I think it was Largo Caballero, who was the Spanish premier at the time, signed the order to create the brigades in October 1936, and a month later they were in Madrid, helping to defend the city, and that defence was successful. The international brigades were international volunteers coming from across the world, actually, and over 2,300 of these came from Britain and Ireland, and coordinated by the Comintern.
2,000 is a fairly big number, really, in the sense of, in light of the non-intervention policy. In terms of the international brigades, there were over 35,000 men and women who joined the brigade in support of the Spanish Republic from across the globe. And again, kind of thinking about the defeat of fascism would supposedly then destabilise fascist regimes across the world. And actually, with the International Brigade, many people joined it having fled from fascist regimes in other places.
Yeah,
I think
that's right. Yeah, there were lots of German members of the brigade, lots of Polish members as well. So obviously, the Nazis were in power by this time, and you've also got a nationalist dictatorship in Poland. Interestingly, there are lots of Jewish members of the brigades that's already fleeing persecution in Germany and Central and Eastern Europe. So yeah, a lot of them were already stateless or already victims of political or ethnic persecution.
That marginalisation as well is quite interesting, isn't it? And certainly from a British perspective, people weren't actually allowed. It was really difficult for them to join the International Brigade because of this policy of non-intervention. Thinking about the author that we both work on as literary PhD students, but Sylvia Townsend Warner, along with her partner Valentine Ackland and several other people as well, had to get fake passports and basically kind of sneak. They weren't part of the international brigades, admittedly, but to actually gain access, people had to sneak across the border and get through it. And I was thinking, actually, is it Geoffrey Cervantes,
the last brigadier?
Yeah. Actually, I think he joined the international brigades as part of a bet with someone in a pub who basically said, you can't join the International Brigade anymore. The borders are closed. It's completely because of the government and so on and so forth. And actually he did it as a bet to show that you could still do it. And he basically got on a boat, headed to Spain, docked in Valencia, and then basically joined up. But I think that, as a little kind of aside and a little tangent, but it does show the kind of the lengths that people were determined to go to join the international brigades. But also, with Warner, the fight in Spain more broadly speaking. But actually, I think to return the focus back to culture, the fact that this was so important to people that they really did find multiple means and methods and sort of sneaky ways of getting across because they believed in this fight so immensely, and it was so central at the time.
Absolutely, and it's good you mentioned Warner, actually, partly because we both work on her, but also because, that illustrates that, the international brigades were one facet of why people went to fight in Spain. So they excluded women, for instance. So actually at the beginning of the war, people from Britain and all over Europe did go to volunteer in Spain. This is before the formation of the brigades. In those early months, you had what was called the milicianas, so Spanish women who would fight in workers' militias alongside their male comrades, which is a really interesting historical moment, quite unprecedented for that to happen. And then with the formation of the brigades and also the kind of formulation of the Republican Army as well in around September 1936, women get excluded from the army and basically directed to industrial war work by the Republic. But so outside of the kind of male-dominated international brigades, you have people fighting for other militias. So famously, George Orwell fights for the Poo Militia, which gets repressed in 1937, but we shouldn't go into that. And
no,
if you want to learn more, you can always read on March to Catalonia.
I was going to say, definitely the best text to read.
But then you have people like Warner who goes over to do secretarial work. I think it's the Spanish Red Cross, actually.
Yes, as part of the Red Cross.
You've got people going over as journalists, people going over to do propaganda work. You've got a lot of British women in particular going over to do nursing work and going over to help with refugee relief. And part of the advantages for people like Warner was that they could have these experiences in Spain. So Warner and her partner go in September 1936. They then go back the following year, July 1937, and they go to the International Congress of Writers in Defence of Culture. And both of those trips give Warner, thinking about the cultural elements of the British Popular Front, they give her an opportunity to write about Spain and to come back to Britain and to start writing short stories, magazine articles, poems, and publishing them. She has an opportunity to publish them in the Popular Front press.
So thinking about obviously Warner, but also the cultural impetus behind the Popular Front. So Jake, you work on British periodicals from the 30s, particularly Left Review.
Yes.
Which also Warner contributed to. So I wonder if you can sort of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, the kind of, as we've already covered to some extent, the sort of animating force behind the Popular Front and its cultural activities was the idea that culture could be used to raise anti-fascist consciousness in Britain, to persuade the majority of the British public that fascism constituted a very real and present threat to democracy. And, people in the Popular Front realised that the best way to achieve that goal was to tell stories and to ignite people's imaginations so that they could, imagine a better world, but also imagine the threat from fascism and to appreciate the history of democracy in Britain and the fact that it was worth defending. So you get a lot of writers getting involved, using their skills in that way. You've got a lot of Popular Front novels published in the period. So Warner published a novel called Summer Will Show in 1936, which is excellent for anyone who hasn't read it. And it's a historical novel. Historical novel was quite an important form for the Popular Front. Another example might be 1649 by Jack Lindsay, which is a historical novel about the English Civil War. Warner's novel is set in 1848 in Paris during the 1848 Revolution, and it's an amazing odyssey, really, that follows the protagonist, who's this upper-class English woman, follows her on a kind of journey of political and also sexual liberation in revolutionary Paris at that time. And so although it's not about fascism directly, it's about resisting tyranny, it's about the sovereignty of the people, and it's about different forms of social liberation. And one way in which this cultural activity was supported was through the Popular Front and the anti-fascist press. So a lot of these writers would, as well as writing and publishing their novels, they would also write for the press in order to propagate their ideas there, and also in order to promote their work as well. One of the most important publications for this kind of activity was Left Review. Left Review ran for 4 years between 1934 and 1938. All of its editors were Communist Party members, but crucially it wasn't a Communist Party organisation, it wasn't funded by the party, and it wasn't, the content of the magazine wasn't dictated by the party. Like the rest of the Popular Front, it was intended to appeal to anyone who was anti-fascist, basically. And it had this amazingly kind of open and often experimental approach to literature. It wasn't at all dogmatic in what it considered to be pure anti-fascist literature. It attracted a very wide range of contributors as well. So, you've got people around W.H. Auden, so Cecil Day-Lewis and people like that. So you also have writers like Storm Jameson, who was a very well-known novelist on the Labour left, writing for it. People like Winifred Holtby, who was a feminist writer who had been involved with Time and Tide, which is a feminist publication that was contemporary with Left Review. It just draws in contributors really from across the British liberal left. And it's got an amazing array of anti-fascist content, really, so full of articles about politics, but it's also full of short stories and poems and reportage and literary criticism. So really the earliest English Marxist literary criticism gets written in Left Review, with people really kind of thinking about literature in Marxist terms for the first time. So it's a very valuable magazine from that standpoint, very valuable to literary historians. And it's incredibly popular. So it had a circulation of 5,000 an issue, which was very high for a magazine of that time. One literary historian puts it in terms of circulation just behind the London Mercury, which was the established kind of conservative literary journal of its day. And, London Mercury was a commercial magazine. It had been around since 1919, very, very popular. So for Left Review, which didn't pay its competitors, interestingly, it was a complete grassroots effort, basically very ad hoc, basically relied on volunteer labour much of the time. For it to get that kind of circulation is a real testament to its quality, and particularly under Edgell Rickword, who was its editor from 1936 onwards. Left Review gets very, very interested in Spain. Spain becomes really its kind of central concern for the rest of its lifespan up until 1938. So you have people like Warner publishing her article Barcelona. In that piece, she describes her experience of being in Barcelona in September 1936, when it was part of the Republican zone, but it was slightly unusual in that it was controlled by anarchist trade unions, which meant that it was a very, an unusually liberated space. And she charts the kind of social changes that have taken place in the city at that time, and also things like the destruction of churches, because of the role that the Catholic Church had played in supporting the military coup and oppressing lots of the Spanish poor and working class as well. You also have very interesting pieces, like there's a piece by Ralph Bates, who was a volunteer for the International Brigades, and he talks about his time, again, strangely, working with anarchists. Even though Left Review was not an anarchist journal, there's lots about the Spanish anarchists in there, because people in England were so curious about them, because there wasn't much of an anarchist tradition in England. So Left Review is very important in terms of building anti-fascist consciousness in Britain, but also building support for the Spanish Republic, getting people to, volunteer and actually go to Spain as soldiers or medical workers, but also to get involved in the Aid Spain campaigns at home in Britain, collect food, collect milk for Spanish children, and raise money as well in fundraising activities. So Left Review is one important cultural endeavour of the British Popular Front, but another important project is the Left Book Club. I know you've done some research into the Left Book Club, Teresa.
Yes, yeah. It built actually on the work of the Left Review. A lot of the people involved in that were actually involved in the Left Book Club as well. So Edra, certainly with Warner, I think particularly she knew Edra Rickwood, who was one of the editors, really, really well. Tom Wintringham and Amabel Williams Ellis. So, and a lot of these people, although they didn't necessarily run, they weren't editors of Left Book Club, and but they were involved with it. And I think that there's lots of crossovers between the organisations. But the Left Book Club idea for this started in 1935 actually, but it never really came to anything. And the premise of it was basically the leading communist booksellers in London, so it was like the Workers' Bookshop, proposed a book club that would offer books chosen from a list of all publishers of left-wing books, and distribute them much more cheaply, and make them therefore more widely accessible. There were lots of people interested, but unfortunately it never actually went anywhere. There wasn't the capital available at that time. And actually the one person who was really interested in it was the publisher Victor Gallant, which I'm sure the name will be familiar to many people.
He was Orwell's publisher as well.
He was Orwell's, yes, yeah. And actually Orwell, The Road to Wigan Pier was actually one of the Left Book Club's books.
Yeah, that's right.
One of its most popular ones as well. But so basically Victor Gallant in January 1936, so this is pre-Spanish Civil War, but with the best-selling Marxist author John Strachey, as well as Harold Lasky, basically they set up between them, with Gallant at its helm, the Left Book Club, and it was officially founded in May 1936. It did have a longer run than Left Review, so the Left Book Club ran from May 1936 until the end of 1948. So because of that, obviously it covers a huge range of things, from including the Spanish Civil War. Obviously then it witnesses the outbreak and sort of exists during the Second World War as well. But I think in some ways, and in similarity to Left Review, the Left Book Club was dominated by the struggles against fascism, and it was part of the movement that believed in the necessity of a popular front in its broadest cultural conceptualisation. But actually it's interesting, and I'm sort of just thinking, in terms of the things that I've been very privileged enough to look at and research, but Gallant's actually stated in his January 1937 editorial, so really early on, in the Left Book Club, but also with regard to the Spanish Civil War, the popular front is not the policy of the Left Book Club, but the very existence of the Left Book Club tends towards a popular front. And I think that's really significant. It's worth saying here that the Left Book Club was not a political like an organ for any kind of party. It wasn't aligned to any particular party. It made a point of saying we're not in any way promoting a particular political view. However, it did really tie in with the communist line. And really, it was left-wing. It was absolutely left-wing. I don't think there were any right-wing pieces within it. And again, people were contributing articles, reviews. You had topic of the month, a lot of which coalesced around the Spanish Civil War and what was going on there, promoting this popular front ethos, essentially. So basically, to defeat fascism, the aim of the Left Book Club was really, really simple. So you had the Left Book Club, which was the organisation. You then had Left Book News, which became Left News, which was its magazine.
Which Warner wrote for, I think.
She did, yes. She wrote for it a few times. And so Gallant stated in kind of one of his many editorials, these came out every month, so he wrote a lot of editorials, and he said very early on that the LBC, Left Book Club abbreviated there, sought to provide the indispensable basis of knowledge without which a really effective united front, which was kind of used again sort of synonymously with Popular Front, of all men and women of goodwill cannot be built. If we are to win, we must have each one of us not less but more knowledge than the best informed of our enemies. And basically this was to help in the terribly kind of urgent struggle for world peace and a better social and economic order and against fascism. And actually it's this emphasis on generating knowledge that was really, really important for the Left Book Club. So again, as I mentioned earlier, what it did was basically publish a left-wing book once a month and distributed them. So it distributed books, obviously left-wing books, for 2 shillings 6pence, so 2d 6p. So that's old money. So this was really, this was incredibly cheap, really, for distributing, and sometimes the books were really, really massive and written by prominent communist authors, despite the fact of not having a particular political affiliation. So John Strachey, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, George Orwell, as we've mentioned already, Ellen Wilkinson, G.D.H. Cole. And there were other Labour Party members who published books. It really was across the spectrum as well, obviously without anarchists, because, as you said, we didn't really have an anarchist tradition in the UK. So these books were chosen by the organising committee, so Gallant's, Harold Lasky and John Strachey. And the idea behind it was not only to educate people about the importance of a popular front and what that meant and why culture was important. And I think one of the things there is, and I'm sure this resonates with Left Review as well, that this brought together writers, artists, intellectuals, musicians, painters, right the way across the cultural spectrum. And particularly for intellectuals, that term was almost like a dirty word in the 30s particularly. Still is in many ways. I think today that kind of resonates, although perhaps less so.
Partly probably because of the Cold War depiction of left-wing intellectuals in the 30s, which is not a positive one.
Exactly. And I think also with that idea, and to return it to what we were talking about earlier with the policy of non-intervention, culture is something that just wasn't deemed a relevant enough reason to go to Spain to defend. Like, defending culture was just seen as blasé, like, well, that's unimportant. We're talking about fascism here and Spain, and the government just didn't see the value of culture, which, as you say, for Left Review, that was a central point as well, was actually like raising awareness of this.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I came across an anecdote the other day about the British consul in one of the Republican cities during the war. He was, I think he was talking to one of the British women who had volunteered as a nurse during the war, and he mentioned that the Spanish sentries that had been set up by the Republic to kind of guard his office had taken to reading all day long. And he basically just couldn't understand it and couldn't see any value in it, and sort of said it's just a passing fad. And he couldn't see why culture would be of value to working class Spanish people. So that contempt for culture was in the 30s was really very deeply rooted in the British political establishment. Yeah.
And this is where so many of these writers, these artists, intellectuals came together. And one of the things with the Left Book Club is it far exceeded any kind of, very much like Left Review in terms of its reach, really, in that it far exceeded its expectations. Within the first month they had 5,000 members. Within a few months they had 20,000 members. I think they peaked at about 60,000. So what Left Book Club does, in terms of, they distributed the books through, it wasn't sent directly to people's houses. So if they signed up and got their membership, it actually was disseminated through local newsagents and booksellers. And so again, kind of fostering that community and that sense of commonality. And actually out of that came lots and lots of different groups that formed it within different regions, different towns, different villages. People would come together, and actually Warner set up a Readers and Writers Club that Julius Lipton talks about in Left Review, funnily enough. And this was the opportunity for bringing people together from across the classes as well. This is the really important thing about it. The Popular Front was not only aligning people from different political parties, it was aligning people from different classes. It was bringing people together. in light of the communist kind of vein and that Marxist narrative in which it's about the working class, a revolution of the working classes, the working classes were seen as the leaders, as socialist leaders. That's obviously not without its problems in some ways, and certainly within the Left Book Club it was a bit of a tense issue. But I think what they were basically trying to do is bring people together. They were showing that everybody's experiences were relevant, were valid. And one of the things with Left Book Club, in addition to disseminating these books, I mean, like Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier, which is incredibly popular actually and went through several editions, and people were coming together to discuss art, culture, literature, and how these things could help overthrow fascism. And that's what's so amazing about it. And this was started before the Spanish Civil War, but it was almost like the Spanish Civil War was the catalyst for that in many ways.
Absolutely. It was the event that brought home the threat of fascism to so many people in Britain. And it's interesting, you talk about the local Left Book clubs being set up all over the country. A lot of the people involved in those clubs would have been involved in Aid Spain movements as well.
Yes, exactly.
And another interesting thing is that the Popular Front and the support for the Spanish Civil War are not at all two exclusive spheres. You've got the same people involved in both of them, but they were kind of set up in remarkably similar ways. So you refer to that Gollancz editorial a few minutes ago where he says, oh, we're not a Popular Front organisation, but we're inevitably part of the Popular Front, i.e. we haven't been kind of hierarchically organised for a specific reason, but we're part of this kind of blooming of political consciousness and culture that's going on all over the country. Interesting, the Aid Spain movements, which were largely, if not dominated, but there was a huge presence of women in these movements as well. The Aid Spain movements were very non-hierarchical, very dispersed. I think there were over 1,000 local groups all over the country, and they provided a way of getting involved in political activity that exceeded normal party lines. The historian Angela Jackson talks about how the Aid Spain movements, because they were so dispersed, because they were largely non-hierarchical, and they were grassroots organisations a lot of the time. Angela Jackson compares the organisation of the Aid Spain movements to the women's movement and the suffrage movement from a decade or 15 years previously. And part of the reason for this was that the traditional parties of the left, which were very hierarchical and very male-dominated, tended to exclude women, if not actively, then through essentially not adapting to the needs of women who were mothers, who had caring responsibilities at home and would find it very hard to attend meetings at a certain time.
Yeah,
so the kind of dispersed, grassroots, kind of almost less ideological nature of the Aid Spain movement gave lots of British women a way to get involved in political activity that didn't make them feel excluded. So I think in the same way as people could go along to their local Left Book Club and get involved in political and cultural activity there, they could also get involved with their local Aid Spain committee and go knocking door to door for donations or for milk or for food donations. So there are interesting parallels, I think, between the Aid Spain movement and the Popular Front. More widely.
And that's the thing, isn't it? And again, the Popular Front is having this massive, not only historical significance, but cultural, political, ideological, social, even economic in some ways, like you're saying, raising money for Spain. And I know Warner contacted Rebecca West, Naomi Mitchison, really famous writers, to ask them for donations for soap to send over. You had Basque refugees coming over as well. And so what the Popular Front is, in many ways, is that it rallied people together from multiple different backgrounds, from different classes, to come together against, as democracy, representative of democracy, fighting against fascism. But all these disparate people and groups coming together to celebrate culture as well, and also celebrate democracy and celebrate the Spanish people as well. I think there was a real draw with Spain as well.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody, I think many volunteers in Spain came back with such a high regard for what they'd seen of the Spanish people in Spain and the way that they resisted Franco under really terrible conditions most of the time, particularly as the war went on. But just going back to what you were saying about, kind of being a celebration of culture, one of the really interesting things about the Popular Front was that it became really quite mainstream as well.
It did,
considering how marginal the British left was in the early part of the 1930s, by the late 1930s, you have mainstream publishers, in Warner's words, cashing in on the left. So
yes,
she
absolutely,
says this in one of her letters, I think, one of her Communist Party comrades. So you have publishers like Faber suddenly wanting to publish Popular Front writers because there was a real market for it. People were excited by the work that was being produced. They were having their political consciousness raised. Interestingly, Warner herself, before she went to Spain the first time in September 1936, she wrote this really funny letter to her publisher where she said, first of all, she was like, oh, if I die, if I'm in a bombing raid and I die, like my will is in like this particular drawer in my room. But then she also says, can you please announce me going to Spain, because I think it would be good advertising for the book. The book being Summer Will Show, which was the novel that she had just brought out. So she was very aware of the fact that in many ways, the Popular Front kind of became, if not big business, then certainly part of the mainstream and very, very popular with the British public. Another interesting thing about the success of the Left Book Club, you were just saying that the point of the Left Book Club was to make literature and to make writing about anti-fascist issues accessible to people. At the same time, you've got the establishment of Penguin by Alan Lane. And at that point, Penguin is almost a Popular Front publisher, really. Alan Lane was very astute and would publish books that would appeal to a Popular Front audience. He ended up taking over John Layman's periodical New Writing and publishing that in a Penguin imprint. And New Writing was basically an anti-fascist journal, kind of similar to Left Review. You also have Alan Lane entering into talks with Randall Swingler, who was Left Review's final editor, about Penguin possibly taking over Left Review. And then something went wrong. It never happened in the end. And Left Review basically just ceased publication. But the fact that Penguin's, and obviously one of the animating drives of Penguin was to provide literature for working class people at a cheaper price than they could get otherwise, kind of illustrates how sort of mainstream the thinking of people like Gollancz was at that time, as Britain headed towards the Second World War.
That's the thing, isn't it? And again, sort of re-emphasising not only the impact of the Spanish Civil War, as we've said all the way through this, in terms of democracy against fascism, but the ways in which everybody was involved. Like there was a sense that something was at stake for everybody here. So everybody was getting involved, whether it was through Left Review, Left Book Club, Penguin, and actually raising awareness of it, this kind of idea of, I think you said, raising political consciousness particularly. Everybody had something to fight for, and as we know, unfortunately, Franco did win in the Spanish Civil War and set up the national government in Spain, which lasted for something like 30 years, I think, in the end.
Yeah, it was in the transition to democracy was the late 70s.
Late 70s, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, okay, the Spanish, Franco won the Civil War in many ways, but I think actually the legacy of the Popular Front, and we had, obviously, the Second World War then, where it really was a fight against fascism. So, and that kind of the threat that it was going to engulf Europe became even more tangible, and obviously it did come to Britain,
and did engulf Europe.
And it did engulf, quite literally. So, and the legacy of the Popular Front, and okay, it did with the Second World War particularly, it did dissipate in many ways. It certainly didn't have the same impetus as it did during the Spanish Civil War, but the legacy of that is so significant, and especially for today as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the Popular Front kind of meets a bit of a sad end, really. I mean, obviously the Second World War happens, but as you kind of head through 1938 and 1939, the sort of, throughout the second half of the 30s, the Popular Front has two aims: stopping war and stopping fascism.
Yep.
As you approach 1939, those two aims become contradictions, because actually people realise if you want to stop fascism, you basically have to go to war against it. And the whole thing kind of collapses there, and people fall out with each other, pacifists and people who kind of support kind of fighting in what they saw as a just war. So the whole thing sort of falls apart as you go into the Second World War. But then, Britain comes out of the Second World War with anti-fascism being really kind of institutionalised in national consciousness.
Absolutely.
And then, as you were saying as well, all the way up to today, these issues are still very pertinent. Obviously today we're in a time of rising nationalism and extreme right-wing ideologies across the world, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just in Europe and North America, but, Turkey, India, Brazil. And I think that the fact that, as we mentioned at the start of the episode, they're putting up monuments in Hull to the current European City of Culture, to British volunteers in the international brigades, suggests how important the Spanish Civil War and its legacy still is for us today in kind of grappling with issues around these ideologies and kind of trying to create a fairer and more just and more democratic society.
With the added emphasis on culture as well. I think that's the other thing.
Exactly.
Is absolutely celebrating culture and thinking about what culture can bring to that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely think that culture still has that political role to play.
Absolutely.
In British society and obviously further afield. I mean, we exist in a very different world today, 80 years on from the Spanish Civil War. So you have different cultural forms now, notably film and TV. I mean, obviously they had film at the time, but film wasn't as important as, you know, kind of theatre and novels for the popular front. We've also got internet culture now, and, you know, lots of today's culture wars take place online. So, yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see what research is being done around contemporary culture wars and how those play out in fiction, film, podcasts, and on the internet generally.
Yeah, absolutely.
The producers of History Chat were Henry Marsh and Tabitha Stanmore. It was brought to you with the kind support of the South West and Wales Doctoral Training Partnership and the Digital Humanities Lab at the University of Exeter.